Somebody sent me
Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Craig Watson. Kelly Jackson, I direct the Robert Nusbaum Center. Really excited about this program today. Years ago, I want to start with a quick explanation. Years ago, late night TV hosts were accused of having their chairs deliberately higher than the chairs of their guests, and kind of like a power thing to remind them who's in charge. And some of you may remember the comedian Andy Kaufman. He had his own talk show where he took that premise to its natural conclusion. And all of that is to say, we could have either 2-inch risers or 16-inch risers. But this is supposed to be a fireside chat, but we feel like a couple of trapeze artists right now. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here today, to join us. When I first came to this area about over 30 years ago, I was just reading the newspaper and reading from an investigative reporter, and I just had never really experienced that before. And that writer was Joe Jackson, and everything he was writing was just so extremely gripping. Since then, he has gone on to write a number of different books, just fantastic books, and just really deeply grateful that we have the opportunity to talk to him today, and really grateful that you're here as well. I'm going to turn this over to Joe.
No. Bring it closer.
Maybe you can yell.
Hello.
There you go.
No.
Use Craig.
Use this one.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Well, if that's the only technical glitch we have, we're doing it. Thank you for coming. I've known Craig for a long time. This is going to be kind of an informal conversation. Back in October, I published this book. I don't know what number it is. It's fairly big. You would have heard if you dropped it on your head, and it's ostensibly about the Spanish and Philippine American Wars of 1898 through 1902. But it's really about how America changed from a republic to an empire in 4 short years, and and as I started doing more research, my real theme became how idealism turns into brutality quite quickly. The way we're going to do this is that I'm going to show a few pictures, and I'm going to read from the introduction, about 6 or 7 minutes. It kind of, the reading kind of presents in a nutshell what the book and our talk is about. And then Craig's going to ask me some questions and a Q&A in which he's going to deconstruct me. And then you guys can, after that, you guys can ask any question you want and turn me into a trembling wreck if you want. But so it's rather informal, and I don't know how Craig feels about you asking questions during our Q&A, but I have no problems with that.
Yeah, actually, what we're going to be doing is, you can see Kelly Jackson there waving. Anytime you want a card, just wave your hand, or if you just write something down on a piece of paper and give it to her, as long as you don't want the paper back, that would be great. and then we'll ask questions later. I'll be posing most of those questions just to bring them together. Thanks.
So the genesis of this book was that when I started writing this book, I was very interested in the way that that a nation can change very quickly, and I wanted to encapsulate a period of time in which our country changed, but I also did not want to write it only from the American point of view. I wanted to have the point of view of all the actors, and so during the research, I traveled across Cuba. This takes place in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines from 1898 to 1902. I traveled across Cuba in a 1955 Ford Fairlane, as old as I am, pristine on the outside. It was on its third Kia engine on the inside. Kathy and I followed in the footsteps of young neo-poet Carl Sandburg as he volunteered to help conquer Puerto Rico with his other volunteer soldiers from Illinois. And then I went to the Philippines for about a month and taught and traveled around and dove into lots of archives. The American story that you often read is much different than what you hear and see in Cuba, and I was fascinated by the way the stories change. One thing that is a theme throughout is the idea of freedom, and that's why Craig asked me to come and talk to you all. We said when we invaded Cuba and when we invaded the Philippines that we were importing, bringing freedom to the Cubans and the Filipinos, and they didn't always necessarily agree with that. So I wanted to get their side of the story too. Now, just a few pictures. When you think about the Spanish-American War, what do you think about? Most Americans think in terms of two images, I think. It's either the wreckage of the explosion of the Maine in Havana Harbor in 1898. That's a photo of the Maine, the U.S. juggernaut battleship, one day after it exploded. There were 300-something people on board, 256 died. And most of the evidence seems to suggest that it was an explosion from the inside rather than a mine from the outside. That's Havana Harbor today, or at least a couple of years ago. See that little steamer behind the giant cruise ship? That's about where the Maine was when it exploded. The Havana Harbor is a tight little place. It's a big oval with only one little entrance in and out. So it's fairly easy to find where the Maine exploded today, even though there are no monuments or anything to it. Perhaps you think of the charge up San Juan Hill instead of the explosion of the Maine. This is a famous and iconic painting by Frederick Remington of the Rough Riders and Teddy Roosevelt charging up San Juan Hill. It's a little bit, it's not exactly a true representation of what happened. That's Teddy Roosevelt in the back on the horse, and he did ride a horse up to a certain extent. However, there were equal numbers of white and black soldiers who charged up San Juan Hill, and But Frederick Remington did not like Indians, and he didn't Native Americans, and he did not like blacks. He was a self-avowed racist, and if you look very carefully, you probably can't see it. There's the head of one black soldier sticking up in the middle of the crowd, meant to represent probably tens and 20s of black soldiers who were there charging up the hill. Or perhaps you think of this iconic photo. This was Teddy Roosevelt with his Rough Riders at the top of San Juan Hill after the battle of that day. They pretty much stopped at San Juan Hill, but most of our histories about the Cuban side of the Spanish-American War is taken from Teddy Roosevelt's point of view. He was a very good publicist. When I think of the Spanish-American War, I think of a more global affair, and I think of the war which stretched from Cuba to the Philippines, in which the United States, by defeating Spain, basically acquired a far-flung global empire. One of these places was the Philippines. And this is a soldier's Polaroid. Polaroids were a new invention during the Philippine-American War. And the soldiers took them around with them everywhere. And this is a photo of an American torture technique called the water cure, in which soldiers, when they were interrogating Filipino guerrillas, poured water down a guerrilla's throat until his stomach swelled up like a toad, and then they jumped on it. And if the insurgent survived, he usually would tell the soldiers what they wanted after at least one or two applications of this. The water cure became emblematic of the savagery of the Philippine-American War here in the United States. The other thing I think of, I love this photo, and I'm going to keep it up here as I'm talking. It's a photo of a giant hill of bones left over from Cuban victims of the Spanish army. The Cubans, in order to try to win the war, they created concentration camps, and that was one of the moral reasons why the United States wanted to get into the Spanish-American War at first, although the explosion of the Maine would be the trigger. One thing I've heard about, which I've not seen because it was censored by the Army, was that there's a similar photo like this of American concentration camps in the Philippines of giant mounds of Filipino bones that's just as high. This guy reminds me of Hamlet in a derby hat looking at Yorick's skull. So basically, even though the Spanish-American War was a global war, it's come down to us as a kind of a heroic moment in American history, and if anything, it was savage, and Americans who thought they were liberators became extremely savage in the advancement of their goals. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to read a short passage from the introduction, which pretty much encapsulates the theme, and then Craig is going to quiz me. Okay? The short war in Cuba gained the United States, the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico, turned the nation into a Pacific power, and created beliefs that America was a stern yet benevolent country tasked by destiny to enforce peace and bring prosperity to the world. If Cuba's liberation created for Americans a vision of themselves as emancipators, the Philippine liberation turned so savage that the public shut it out of mind. It is easier to forget unsavory truths than to face them. The new Philippine Republic believed that the United States would deliver them from Spain, as it had the Cubans. Instead, the war that resulted transformed the archipelago into a post-apocalyptic wasteland of famine, disease, ecological disaster, and hundreds of thousands dead. The Splendid War created this, becoming the template for every American small war in the 20th and 21st centuries. It was a war of choice that started in a wave of idealism and disintegrated into brutality. America's dependence on overwhelming force would form the assumption that, as in Cuba, war should be quick and relatively bloodless. That has echoes to right now. Instead, outgunned opponents became an insurgency. The U.S. response throughout the coming decades would proceed with such near-identical ruthlessness as to seem scripted. Though usually treated as separate conflicts, the wars in Cuba and the Philippines should be seen as a continuum, one that begins with two similar Cuban and Filipino poet martyrs who shaped their nation's identities, and ends with the United States entering as a savior, only to become a surge. One is reminded of the opening of T.E. Lawrence's Seven Pillars of Wisdom, Lawrence of Arabia, where the ideal of a people devoted to freedom heeds first to an unquestioning possession and then to an overmastering greed for victory. By our own act, Lawrence wrote, we were drained of morality, of volition, of responsibility, like dead leaves in the wind, as we'd already done to Native Americans. In order to save them, we had to kill them. How did this happen so quickly, affect the individual American, and shape the national character? That's the real inquiry of my book. The consequences were as momentous as casualties were light. Overnight, it seemed the nation morphed into an imperialistic power in the mold of the European empires it disparaged. This was the war in which General Jacob Smith demanded, I want no prisoners, I wish you to kill and burn, in which American doctors and a nurse martyred themselves against yellow fever, in which black Americans watched prejudice grow worse, in which an exhausted Clara Barton wrote, had the nation gone mad? Others felt uneasy about the change they did not understand. On October 12, 1899, Minnesota Governor John Lynn tiptoed around his misgivings when welcoming home state volunteers from the Philippines. The mission of the American volunteer soldier has come to an end. For the purpose of conquest, he is unfit, since he carries a conscience as well as a gun. The United States was born in a revolt that survived the cataclysmic rebellion of 1861 through 1865. But not until the conflict in Cuba and the Philippines did America's love of war become so bold that one can track the transformation. On January 2, 1897, Theodore Roosevelt told students of the Naval War College, all the great masterful races have been fighting races, and the minute that a race loses the hard fighting virtues, then no matter how skilled in commerce and finance, in science or art, it has lost its proud right to stand as the equal of the best. No triumph of peace is quite so great as the supreme triumphs of war. The speech was published to glowing reviews and would be, in one form or another, justification for military buildup throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. With the events in Cuba and the Philippines, the United States increasingly became a culture of war with a sense of global purpose, prone to jingoistic eruptions. The rhetoric of war became that of patriotism. God has not been preparing the English-speaking and Teutonic people for 1,000 years for nothing but vain and idle self-contemplation and self-admiration, claimed the Roosevelt ally Albert Beveridge. No, he has made us the master organizers of the world in order to govern, quote, savages and senile people. Even the Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper scribe William Allen White would rationalize change. It is the Anglo-Saxon's manifest destiny to go forth in the world as a world conqueror. He will take possession of all the islands of the sea. He will exterminate the peoples he cannot subjugate. That is what fate holds for the chosen people. It is so written. Those who would protest will find their objections overruled. It is to be. The culture of war became indelible, a new Orwellian world in which, according to Paul Fussell, war becomes peacekeeping and the acceptance of any act in the name of freedom a citizen's duty. Quote, those who challenge the authenticity of American altruism were by definition evildoers and mischief makers, observed the historian Archibald Carey Coolidge. So fully were Americans in the thrall of the moral propriety of their own motives as to be unable to recognize the havoc their actions often wrought on the lives of others. It is easy for moral certitude and blindness to be one. At its heart lay a darker certainty. Those who needed our help were lesser beings because they were not American. It lay in the order of things that they accept American guidance. Dissenters were not only misguided but corrupt and thus enemies. The myth plays out often in my life, from the Bay of Pigs to Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and it's extending these days. The leaders we elect always act surprised when things go awry. Since one classical definition of mental illness is the tendency to repeat obviously self-destructive behavior, one wonders how deeply our cherished myths make us willfully blind and mad. Though those in power rarely heed historical lessons, neither do the Americans who vote them in. A people unaware of its myths is likely to continue living by them, warned the cultural historian Richard Slotkin, though the world around that people may change. Your turn. What do you want this?
I'll yell.
No. We're not yell.
Even if it involves doing that. No, I think this works. Thank you. I had a professor who used to say, in this class, we don't start from scratch. Here, we go back and create the itch. And this is what I want us to do initially, is go back and create the itch. The first time you and I talked about this, my wife and I were eating at Jason's Deli, and you were waiting for food, and we started talking, and I realized I knew absolutely nothing about the Spanish-American War.
And I got a muffaletta sandwich.
So, just to think back to this time for just a second, I want to start with the title of the book, Splendid Liberators. Who called it splendid?
Well, that's an echo of what Theodore Roosevelt had an older family friend who was the ambassador to England. His name was John Hay. And after the war was over, after the invasion of Cuba was over and the fighting stopped, it was about 6 to 8 weeks. It was very short. Remember, there were many more people who died than were advertised. Hay wrote to Theodore Roosevelt and said that even here in England, people are starting to pay more attention to us. It was certainly a splendid little war, and so the title was originally Liberators, with an ironic intent, but it turned out that there were lots of books being published with the name Liberators right now, so we changed it to Splendid Liberators to echo the splendid little war.
You know, when we were talking, let me go back and talk more about where all this began. When we were talking, you mentioned sort of in some respects, the thesis of this is this 4-year period is the template of.
It's a template it's a couple of things. I mean, I had started researching the book, and then Kathy and I were wiped out by a drunk driver, and I was we were sitting at home recuperating when January 6th occurred, the attack on the Capitol, and it occurred to me, I was thinking, who are we? How did things change this quickly? And so part of it is an investigation of how people can change so quickly. Okay? The other thing was, as I was looking at as I was doing all of this research, I've always been in love with that Lawrence of Arabia quote. I mean, just the idea that we start into something with the best of intentions and we basically turn savage and almost evil. That's just a theme that is very powerful. And so you notice that I dragged poor old Lawrence of Arabia into this pretty quickly. So yeah.
So did this, you talked about sort of the general theme, 1898. Why did you focus on this? Or did this grow out of other interests you had or other work you've done?
Well, at first I was paying attention to two people who were mirror images of one another. A fellow who was a guerrilla, an American who was a guerrilla during the Cuban run-up before our invasion, and he became an armyman, and he started hunting an American black soldier who became a hero for the Filipino insurgents. He went over to the Filipino side because of the prejudice that he saw being wreaked upon the Filipinos and black soldiers. So it started with that, but I think that when I was sitting there watching the attack on the Capitol, that I was thinking, I was wondering how can a culture change so quickly in such a short time? And so that became a big part of my theme right there. So I don't know if I answered it.
Yeah, no, it's good. At what moment in your research did you begin to realize, hey, this isn't the story that I thought it was going to be?
Well, there are a lot of hidden histories in here. It's really interesting. In the United States, when you read about the Spanish-American War, you almost always read about the charge up to San Juan Hill, and it's often, until recently, I mean, I'm not the first to pay attention to this, but it's often cast in heroic terms. But there are a lot of accounts which I discovered, which had not been included in histories. There was one by a Rough Rider who later became an ambassador to Nicaragua and elsewhere, a fellow by the name of Herman Hoffman Phillip, who described the battle, but he really described how badly served the American soldiers were. There was no real advanced plan for medical care, and he was thrown into a pile of. The doctors thought he was grazed on his forehead. He passed out the day after the charge at San Juan Hill. He passed out. He was taken down to a field hospital and thrown into a pile of dead. And if he hadn't woken up, he probably would have been buried. There was an account in the Philippines. The U.S. Marines have this famous. They honor something that they call the March Across Samar, where a bunch of Marines marched across the island of Samar, and in order to connect the east and west side, and they were nearly wiped out, and they nearly starved to death. And I found an account by one of the Marines that basically showed how, in order to survive, and this is something which has never come out, in order to survive the march, they killed and ate their Filipino porters. That kind of stuff, that savagery, has never really been written about, and I wanted to bring it out. Like I said, what's also interesting is that when I went to the Philippines, many of the historians that were bringing out these tales of savagery by American soldiers were American expatriates. They had been in the military. Then they became professors in Filipino schools, and they were uncovering all this stuff, and their work was being published in the Philippines, but it wasn't being published here, and it was as if they felt betrayed, they felt enraged, and I was fascinated by that. So, there's a different side to this war, to this global conflict, which is often cast in heroic terms, and I wanted to show that.
I was going to ask you if there was, the exciting thing about research is finding something like a document or a letter or a person you've never experienced before, and then going, whoa, that opens. It sounds like that was partially the case right there.
Right.
Other things that just made you go, oh, that's...
Well, it was real interesting too. I mean, you go to Cuba and you go to the Philippines, and people live their history more there than they do in the United States. History is a lot more real there, and than immediate, I think, than it is in the United States. And in both places, the Cuban and the Filipino guerrillas basically asked the United States to come in and deliver them from the Spanish Empire, but to treat them as a protectorate, protect them from the other European empires circling around, but let them develop their countries in their own way. That was to them their definition of freedom. The United States, however, had other designs. They basically felt that the Cubans and Filipinos could not self-govern, that they were not politically mature enough to govern themselves. A lot of that also had to do with American business interests that wanted to be there. But because of that, when I was talking to Cuban and to Filipino historians and even people on the street, there was this sad sense of betrayal. I mean, it was really very interesting. I thought it was almost like there was a Filipino professor who said it's almost like the Cubans and the Filipinos felt like jilted lovers. We brought the Americans in and they betrayed us. There's still a sense of betrayal. And that's something that when I was there, I kept hitting time and time again, in which I wanted to explore this idea of this sense of the people who we were ostensibly supposed to save, still feeling like they had been betrayed. And it's a very real thing. It's something that I don't think I learned about when I was growing up and taking history classes.
We called this event today Liberators or Occupiers,
Right.
Rethinking. Was there a moment that stands out in either Cuba or the Philippines that where the U.S. clearly crossed from liberation into occupation? So I guess that it's not that simple.
Well, I mean, it happened in both Cuba and the Philippines. I mean, so maybe there were two moments. There was a moment when it became obvious in Cuba that we could make a lot of money by buying up. The United States could make a lot of money by buying up many of the bankrupted sugar plantations, and we stayed in Cuba until the 1959 revolution under Castro. There's still a sense of anger at how we turned Cuba into a economic colony. In the Philippines, the moment was when the Filipino government, Philippine rebels under a fellow by the name of Emilio Aguinaldo, who today is thought of as the George Washington of the Philippines, kind of a controversial George Washington, created a constitution in the American style, but the American occupiers said, no, it's not good enough, and so we occupied Manila, faced off with the Filipino forces many times. Finally, there was shooting on both sides, and we overran them and slaughtered their forces. What was really interesting to me also was Craig was talking about how this is a template. You see this, you didn't see this in Cuba so much with the Americans, but you did see this in the Philippines. The Philippines, when I was growing up, occasionally I would hear historians talk about how the Philippines were pretty much an early example of America's Vietnam. And what they meant by that was that the American forces have depend upon overwhelming force in the very beginning to knock out the forces, the enemy forces, and they think that that's going to solve all the problems. What happens instead is that an insurgency, a guerrilla war, sets in, and you have a long war. And so the Philippine conflict was a mirror example of what you have again and again and again. Afghanistan, Vietnam, Iraq, Iran, if we have boots on the ground, as Trump is saying we might. I mean, it's just the same, it's the same pattern again and again. And so that's something that I was really surprised about.
When we asked you, we had no idea that.
No, when I wrote this, I mean, Venezuela and Iran, and Greenland were not on the table.
Did Americans believe their own rhetoric, or were they conscious of empire building?
Well, I mean, even then, I mean, there's always a split. What's interesting when you talk to other cultures about the United States is that there's an acknowledgement of a split. I mean, we seem to see ourselves as, and for the longest time, as the world's savior. The rest of the world sees us as kind of a schizophrenic nation. I mean, we have a very dangerous side, but we can be open-handed about resources. USA was probably a good example of that.
I'm just happy to spend time with you.
So there was this, but Americans, I think, see themselves, at least for the longest time, I remember now what you were saying, they saw themselves as the world's police. Well, in the beginning of the 20th century, they saw themselves as the world's savior. They were going to Christianize the world, just as the British Empire had said it was going to. By the Cold War, we were the world's policemen. So we saw ourselves in a good light. We did not see, we saw ourselves as a kind of a savior. We did not see ourselves as dangerous allies or a schizophrenic nation.
Good, thank you. Kelly's walking around holding up cards. If you have any interest or if you want a card or if you have something, and Kelly, if you could bring those to me, I'd appreciate it as well. Could you talk I'm sorry?
They can just raise them.
They can just raise their hand too.
Yeah,
Yeah, let's just raise a hand. Yeah, go
Hey,
ahead.
Joel.
Hey, Joe.
Hey, Joel.
You know, I look at Iran, and as we've sort of studied it over the last number of decades, they still go back to the 50s. Okay. And we forget that we put the Shah in
We do,
power.
yeah, I
okay.
know.
And they don't forget.
No.
Right? And we don't maybe forget, or we remember something that happened in this country, right? More than some people who might be in other countries. But can you talk about Cuba in particular? And about because right now, Trump is very open. He wants to take Cuba. This is Marco Rubio's dream, I think, is to
Right.
liberate his former country. So as we are now, seem to be approaching the next conquest here. What do you think? And they don't live a very good life there in Cuba, right? Since
They're having a hard time.
very hard time, as you saw when you were driving across the country.
And
I'm
it's
sure.
even worse now.
Right. So, but even despite all that, where you might think they're going to see us as liberators from just across, you can see Florida from here, right?
90 miles.
90 miles. Okay. How do you think most of the people, regardless of whether suffering or not suffering in Cuba, see the United States in 2026, knowing what you know about what happened in 1898, 99?
Well, I mean, Cuba's relationship with the United States, present relationship with the United States is very complex because, so many Cubans have friends and family who live in South Florida or throughout the United States. And they, the people who live in Cuba, they get huge packages from their relatives in the United States. Everything from 40-inch LED TVs to American currency to Air Jordans to this kind of white house paint, which they can't get in Cuba. And so, there are familial ties, and it's not like there's a division of hatred there. At the same time, the Cubans that I ran into were very proud of the fact that they were Cuban, that they had stood up to the northern giant for years, decades, now centuries. They're very proud of the fact, even though the communist government has not worked out that well, they're very proud of the fact that every month the Cuban government, especially under the Castros, would deliver big baskets of goods, especially if you had a baby or a young child, with diapers and milk and rice and all sorts of stuff that that the government watched out for its people. It cared for its people. It wasn't a ruthless economy. This is how they saw it. It wasn't a ruthless economy, dog eat dog, as you found 90 miles to the north. And so, even though you hear Donald Trump saying that we're going to run Cuba, and even though the Cubans are having a very hard time of it right now, more are immigrating to all countries than ever before, I seriously doubt that they would agree to being, quote, run by the United States. They could partner with the United States. They could be friends with the United States. It would do a lot to lift the embargo after so many years, after so many decades. It seemed when I was there, most of the investment that was going on was by Chinese investors, which seemed really stupid to me, that we're allowing, arrival into our backyard when just a little bit of friendliness would go far, but I don't think the Cubans have insisted upon their own identity since the 1800s, when even then the United States was looking at taking them over.
Thank you. Joe, we've entered our speed round. We have 5 minutes with 3 questions,
Okay.
and they're kind of related, and then afterwards, after we leave, if folks have questions, you'll still be around.
No, I'll just do it.
Okay, question number 1. Within the American school system, we're taught about glory wars where Americans are glorified. We see this throughout history. What is a way, or is there a way we can talk and teach about these horrors in the school system, or do you think that's possible?
I think it could. I mean, poor teachers, especially high school teachers, I mean, they may be putting their jobs at risk because, I mean, so much of public school education is politicized these days, but you can send your students out to read other stuff besides Teddy Roosevelt, I think. So.
Regardless of the standard, living in a country, isn't it always problematic for another country to interfere, especially with violence? I'm worried about the possible rise of ethnocentrism. What's your opinion?
Well, the problem, I think that's an interesting question, and I don't know if I can answer it within the speed round. But I mean, when we invaded Cuba and when we invaded the Philippines, we said we were going to import freedom to them. They already had their own ideas about freedom, and so, I mean, there are cultural differences which are very hard to overcome, and you just don't do things overnight. And it may be the human condition that everybody wants a quick solution to problems, but Americans especially seem to want a quick solution to questions of freedom and questions of problems. I don't think that works. I think it's very hard to do that.
Next question is, I desperately want to buy this book. Where can I get it? I need that.
You can get it on Amazon. It's going to come out. Okay, so it's in hardcover right now. It's going to come out in if you can be patient, it's going to come out in trade paperback later this year. It'll be a whole lot cheaper. But you can still get it on Amazon. You can still go over to JM Prints and get it over there.
If you order it today, by the way, it's on Amazon. It is 40% off.
Oh, well, go.
One final question.
And if you buy it, okay, a plug. I have a chance to make a plug. If you buy it, then you can email my Kathy over there in the red, and I'll sign it for you.
Will that cut down on the resale value?
No, it makes it intensely valuable.
If we leave wrestling with one question, what would you want that question to be?
Who are we? Who are we as a nation? I mean, that was something that Carl Sandburg wrestled with. You kind of use him as the conscience in my book. We say that we're here to save the world, or at least help the world, but do we really? The people that we keep voting in, they have a tendency to make our presence known throughout the world by force. I think we should think more clearly about where our leaders are going and what our leaders are doing when we go to the polls, instead of just voting emotionally. Because you go overseas in a that's really amazing. You go overseas, and no matter whether you are Republican, Independent, or Democrat here, you go overseas and you are your country, and you have to spend a lot of time talking to people saying, I don't necessarily agree with this. When I was over in Cuba, it was really interesting. I had a couple of Cuban guides, and one of them was a history professor at the University of Havana, and his wife was studying for her finals, and she's pregnant. She's a nice young woman, and she looked up at me, and we've been laughing about all sorts of things, but she was reading a history of the Woodrow Wilson years, the gunboat diplomacy years, for her history class, and she looked up at me and says, I do not think I like your country very much. And it took me by surprise. And I looked at what she was reading, and I said, well, you know, I can't blame you for that. There's a lot in our history which is not very sterling. And then I was on the north coast of Cuba, and overlooking the Straits of Florida, and there was a giant blockhouse where the Guardia Civil used to have its outposts, watching for supposed American invasion, but a lot of it was to watch for people trying to make their way to Key West. And there was this Argentinian guy. He heard that I was talking to some friends. He heard that I was American. Obviously, he could tell I was American. And he goes, we are all Americans here. And he was really angry. And I turned to him and I said, yeah, I agree. And we started talking about the Americas, South and North America. But I mean, you know, you are your country wherever you go, and you have to think about that, and you have to think about the consequences of your vote. So I guess that's it.
That's great. Thank you.
One thing. Those of you who are professors who have monographs or books, there's a big civil suit about your books being pirated to train Anthropic AI. You can make a claim against Anthropic. I have a way of doing that. If you email Kathy, I can send you something where you can make a claim, but you only have until March 30th.
Thank you all for being here today. Thank you so much.